As with all sci-fi pulsi, this is going to contain a lot of speculation and a lot of me trying to fill in the blanks and come up with kind of a coherent explanation for this. The truth of the matter is, when I'm dealing with any kind of thing with a lot of lore involving it, I do a lot of research, but I'm obviously going to miss things just because of how extensive it is. Like, if I'm dealing with something like Star Wars or StarCraft or something, it's just there's too much for me to read all of it. There's also the issue with stuff contradicts other stuff, certain things make certain implications, etc. And it can be very hard to determine what actually is canon and what actually isn't canon. So my focus is normally to try to take what I think tells the story the best and fits the best in with whatever the thematic or plot related things I think it's trying to portray. And that's an issue with Stalker because the game has a very troubled development history made by CGS Game World in Ukraine. It went through numerous versions. I think it was initially called Oblivion Lost. If you look at the mods, most of the mods are just restoring cut content, and they'll add additional elements or remove additional elements from the story or lore. And the games will sometimes contradict one another, like they'll have things in one game, etc. There's also the issue where Clear Sky is a prequel to Shadows of Chernobyl, and that always leads to kind of contradictions or issues between the two. There's also the general problem whenever you're writing fiction that you have to issue corrections. And corrections aren't just like in interviews, it's like in a future thing when you're trying, you realize you've written yourself into a corner, and you just have to go back and try and harmonize it, or just say, oh, this happened previously. I know it's not exactly what happened, but for the sake of preserving overall integrity, we're just going to pretend this happened in the previous game. That being said, Stalker is difficult to deal with because its development history was super troubled. A lot of it is kind of paying homage or references to other works. Like, in a certain sense, you could almost consider the movie Stalker and the book Roadside Picnic to kind of be part of the broader canon, as it draws a lot of aspects from it, and even kind of characters from some of it also appear in Stalker. It's a very kind of an interesting mythology, but that's being said, let's kind of get into it. So I think the most interesting part of CGS Game World and 4A Games, which is the successor to it, it's kind of confusing. Basically, when the company went semi-bankrupt after the release of Call of Pripyat, some of the people left, or maybe it was before Call of Pripyat, it's very confusing. Some of the people from CGS Game World left and founded 4A Games, which produced the now... there's going to be 3 Metro games. There's Metro 2033 and Metro Last Light, which are in many ways very similar to Stalker. The subject matter is extremely similar. The gameplay elements are similar. The gameplay itself is similar. And kind of the underpinnings of it, the focus on ideology, etc., that the main characters are similar. So it all is very kind of confusing because you have these two universes that are very similar, made by different game companies that had members of the original, and they both take ideas from one another. So I think that's enough rambling. Let's start talking about Stalker. So I think the most interesting part about Stalker, and this is also the same for Metro Last Light, the Metro series, is that they place a lot of focus on ideology. The idea is, even at the end of the world, even in the face of apocalypse, humanity innately wants something more than just survival. They want some sort of grander cause they can believe in, be it ideals like freedom, like responsibility, like brotherhood, religion perhaps. These things will still have meaning, even in the case of humanity having a total survival situation. And ultimately, that's kind of all we're going to have left. In a lot of cases in their games, both 4A and CGS Game World, the kind of the protagonists or the hero characters are those who remain committed to an ideology or an ideal or something in the face of overwhelming odds, whereas the villains tend to be those who are primarily concerned merely with material gain, be it money, be it power, however you want to define it. Within the Metro series, this takes the form of more traditional ideologies. You have the communists, the Nazis, the polis, which is kind of a classical Greek republic feel, and then the Hansa, which are kind of a more capitalist, mercantile feel. However, in Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl, the factions you have are a little more abstract, I guess. They aren't necessarily based on a traditional ideology. They kind of conform to broad ideological leanings. You have duty, which is kind of more authoritarian, conservative. It kind of has fascistic elements and kind of traditionalist elements to it. You have freedom, which is libertarian and liberal, I guess you could say. That is obviously from a standpoint a lot more focused on freedom. You have people who are neutral, who don't take a side. You have those who are kind of working for the greater good, even if they have to do a lot of evil to get there. You still have those who are only interested in themselves, in selfish gain, and you have those who are working for the best interest of humanity. And kind of one of the premises of the series is that these ideas matter. And if anything, they kind of matter more than what's actually happening on the ground. You have all this, like I said, survivalism, you have mutants, etc. But ultimately, I kind of feel the game comes down to your vision of the future and kind of how you perceive the world. And Stalker 1 is very good at that because the different endings, particularly the two true endings, I think present a very interesting moral choice. And even though there is a sequel to it, which kind of does have one of them as a canon ending, it's left very ambiguous what the results were of your decision or lack of decision in the first Stalker game and kind of how it had impact later on. Nothing is very clear in this franchise, and I think that's kind of by design. So that being said, let's kind of get into the history of it and kind of the more political science aspects of it. I know this one's I'm focusing a little more on narrative than the politics per se, but that's kind of the name of the game. So over time, the Soviet Union developed a number of different research areas in what would eventually become the Zone, who, I'm trying to think of how you describe it, research the more esoteric aspects of existence. Whether or not you want to consider the Noosphere to be kind of soft science fiction or to be more kind of fantasy or horror elements is kind of difficult to grasp. But basically the goal of the research institutions was to investigate mind control, the collective unconsciousness, etc., specifically with the idea of being able to reprogram people. Obviously, kind of the Soviet idea of using mass propaganda, etc., and fear to try to change human nature had failed, as evidenced by revisionism in the aftermath of Stalin's death, and the inability of the most radical communist states like Maoist China and the Khmer Rouge to function properly. They weren't able to really fundamentally change human nature using force and using conventional means. So they came up with the idea that they try to kind of go beyond it. They go beyond basic psychology and try to get into the fabric of existence, etc. So somewhere during their investigations, they discover something called the Noosphere. So the Noosphere, according to the wiki, denotes the sphere of thought. That is, I like to think of it as kind of being the collective unconscious. The wiki describes it as the third in the succession of phases of development of the Earth after the geosphere, that is innate matter, and the biosphere, life. Just as the emergence of life fundamentally transformed the geosphere, the emergence of human thought and human consciousness fundamentally transformed the biosphere. For s.t.a.l.k.e.r, the Noosphere emerges through and is constituted by the interaction of human minds. The Noosphere has grown in step with the organization of the human mass in relation to itself as it populates the Earth. As mankind organizes itself in more and more complex social networks, the higher the Noosphere will grow in awareness. So basically, it's the collective unconscious, it's the collective will of humanity, and it's kind of how we all telepathically and psychically interact with one another. So the Soviets, kind of after formulating this, tried to come up with ways of altering it, be it through biology, be it through radio waves, etc. So this research kind of continues along, and eventually we have the historical Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster, and the entire area becomes extremely irradiated. Now, this actually proves a boon for the research that's going on there because you have all the radiation and just kind of the weird factors of the area. You have a bunch of high-powered antenna. You have an area that really nobody lives in and nobody's likely to go in the foreseeable future. And my understanding is that at least part of the nuclear power plant is still functional, so they have all the electricity they could ever want to continue their research. Throughout the Stalker games, you find numerous underground and secret research labs that are set up by the group of scientists called the Group. They weren't very creative with that one. For the purposes of altering the Noosphere. And as the Soviet Union continues to kind of ground to a halt, in the complete absence of any oversight, they get more and more radical with their experiments. Now, interestingly, the collapse of the Soviet Union does not stop the project, and it actually redoubles it. Because, as we know today, the Ukraine is a very unstable, large country that has a lot of trouble maintaining control over its territory to begin with, let alone manage a toxic ruin like Chernobyl. So like I said, they continue on, and eventually they begin to make large-scale breakthroughs. By the year 2016, they are able to, in their view at least, understand the Noosphere enough to try to make changes to it. Now, like I said in the beginning, the ultimate goal of them was to alter human nature. They wanted to remove ideas like hatred, sadism, greed, basically the sinful aspects of human nature from the collective unconsciousness, and bring about a utopian version of the world. They felt that by doing this on kind of a more esoteric, abstract plane, it would have a more kind of lasting and permanent impact than the Soviet Union did, which ultimately obviously failed in its attempts to create a heaven on Earth. So with a combination of nuclear power, a bunch of antennas, and other technology, 7 volunteers were able to merge their minds together into the being known as sea consciousness. Using the collective psychic power of their minds, enhanced by the various technological devices, they attempted to directly open and alter the Noosphere. However, all they succeeded in doing was ripping open the fabric of reality, creating the zone as we see it within the game, where you have all these anomalies, things that defy the laws of physics, defy the laws of reality. You can teleport. There's various electrical discharges, like I said, teleporting, things that throw people into the air, etc. You also begin to find artifacts, which are ordinary objects normally that have undergone intense, I'm trying to think of how to, irradiation isn't really, alteration I guess is the word you use for it, alteration by the damage to the Noosphere, and have gained properties that are fantastical. Some of them will do things like deflect bullets, they'll increase the speed of healing, they'll remove radiation. They kind of have these fantastical abilities that have immense uses for the outside world. Now, the issue that sea consciousness is coming across now is not only have they failed, but you have the creation of the zone. And the zone is slowly growing over time. And the fear is eventually it'll encompass the entirety of the Earth. So sea consciousness, with its immense telepathic abilities, is able to restrict the expansion of the zone. The zone is constantly growing, but it's growing very slowly as it's putting all this effort into it. Meanwhile, the team of scientists is attempting to figure out what went wrong and try to correct it. Now, half of the scientists break off and form the group that will become known as Clear Sky, while the other half remain committed to the Sea Consciousness project. So as all these anomalies have opened, in particular the artifacts have, you begin to see stalkers come in en masse, and the stalkers begin to steal the artifacts and sell them to the outside world. The Ukrainian government attempts to restore control over the zone by sending waves of military stalkers and tanks and stuff in. However, these large formations are easily broken apart by the various anomalies and mutants, and you get into the scenario where Ukrainian sovereignty over the zone is a nominal proposition at best. Throughout the games, you'll find areas that are controlled by the military, and the military will sometimes fly by and attack helicopters. But by and large, they kind of understand that the zone isn't the Ukrainian government's anymore, and the best they can try to do is blockade the zone and the main entrance areas. Even then, the army is very poorly paid, and they're stuck in a kind of this area in the middle of nowhere, and none of them really want to give their lives, like I said, when they aren't being paid particularly well in this strange environment. So they're extremely corrupt and will take bribes from the stalkers in the form of artifacts and money. Artifacts are worth millions of dollars to the right buyers, so many stalkers are exceedingly wealthy, and they'll bribe the army for not only access to the zone and for looking the other way when they smuggle things out, but they'll also buy rations from the army. They'll also buy weaponry, armor, all that kind of stuff. So the army is in practice just kind of a corrupt entity that does little more than facilitates traffic in and out of the zone and takes bribes. Now, remnants of the various army expeditions form the faction known as Duty. Duty is very similar. They're kind of a Knight Templar faction. They have a code of brotherhood. They call each other brother. They have a very strict bureaucracy and rank system with ranks based on military ranks. So you'll have sergeants, colonels. It's led by a general. Almost all of them are ex-military, and they believe, as their name suggests, that it's their duty to protect the world from the zone. So duty patrols will go out and kill all the mutants they can find. The artifacts they collect, they pass on to scientists. They believe their goal is to destroy the zone and prevent it from, like I said, expanding out and devouring the entirety of the Earth. They control the only city in the zone, and any kind of form of order that it has is kind of a result of them. So the Ukrainian government, as far as we know, kind of gives them tacit approval and doesn't really, it kind of tells the army to avoid contact with them. Whether or not the army provides them with weapons, I'm not entirely sure. It's possible, and given how well equipped they are, some people have suggested that they're kind of a proxy for Russia and the west of the Warsaw Pact, or I guess kind of the post-Cold War Warsaw Pact, and they might have links to the Russian government. They certainly do the Ukrainian government. Now, they're opposed by Freedom, who is a collection of idealists that believe that the zone needs to be open and that the technology developed from the artifacts and anomalies within will lead to a golden age for all of humanity. Now, it's highly speculated that given that Freedom uses NATO weapons and they kind of have a more liberal and pro-Western ideology, that they're being funded and backed by NATO. I don't think it's directly stated anywhere in the game, but a lot of fans tend to think that. And that kind of also brings in the whole ideological thing and really the whole Cold War, because there is kind of this war between the two of them. And while it is a hot war, it's not necessarily a Cold War. Both factions are too powerful to really wipe one another out. So periodically through the games, they exist in a state of uneasy truce, where they just restrict it to fighting over marginal territories and skirmishes rather than actively trying to wipe each other out. You also have the ecologists, who most factions tend to like, who are scientists sponsored by the Ukrainian government and in other international countries, who operate in the zone with bunkers and stuff, and they're either protected by loners, the military, or duty, and all they do is just basically do research. So pretty much everybody likes them. No one really harasses them. Duty, as I said, just gives all of the artifacts they recover to them. And they kind of aim from people who are trying to shut down the zone because they're afraid of its expansion, to viewing it as the greatest scientific opportunity in the history of mankind, which is very likely the case. And then most stalkers are just independent and just trade with one another and try to explore the zone and just kind of have this kind of cowboyish, adventurous frontier spirit. So with all these people swarming in, and the number of artifacts getting more frequent the deeper you make your way into the zone, stalkers are starting to try to reach the zone, the center of the zone, which is a bad thing because C Consciousness has their main laboratory underneath the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And they don't want anyone to figure out that they were the ones behind it or to stop their research, because at this point they're still... They perhaps naively have the belief that the only way to stop the zone is to continue it and eventually expand C consciousness, maybe put some more people in it and improve their technology and then try to kind of undo what they undid. which, to be fair, is probably the only way of dealing with it at that point in time. No one else really even knows about the Noosphere, and they've had like decades of research into it. So it can be thought that sea consciousness is, to a certain extent, by this point, a necessary evil. They also developed the Brain Scorcher, which is a radio array that, well, scorches people's brains and makes them into zombies, or just damages their higher thought functions and makes them into monolith members. Now, the monolith is something they set up in the center of the zone to be something of a distraction. It's this giant, well, monolith, and the legend they spread is that if you reach it and you wish for something, then your wish will come true. And it's a distraction because the fake endings of the first game are a series of wishes based on your actions throughout the game that you make when you reach the monolith, and they're all kind of monkey's paw type things. Like s.t.a.l.k.e.r in one will wish for wealth, and he'll see gold falling down around him, only for him to realize it's actually nuts and bolts from the ceiling, and the ceiling will cave in on him. One of them is, I want to rule the world, in which the monolith will absorb him, because the zone will eventually cover the earth. So that's, like I said, to distract them, and they've brainwashed a large number of the strongest stalkers in the zone to become the Monolith faction, which is by far the largest faction, and they occupy the entire center of the zone. They are protected largely from the further effects of the emissions and the Brain Scorcher, and they can also count on huge armies of mutants and zombies to fulfill their will. So they're basically a cult that's hated by everybody. So that's kind of the political situation you have coming into the games. Monolith continues to fortify and hold the center of the zone. Freedom and Duty hold the rest of the zone, with a couple pockets occupied by the military. And everybody's kind of at an uneasy standstill. All the while, the zone continues to expand, the anomalies get worse, and the situation becoming increasingly unstable. In the events of Shadow of Chernobyl, s.t.a.l.k.e.r succeeds in reaching the center of the zone for a second time, and after speaking with sea consciousness, comes to believe that the zone itself is a result of sea consciousness's existence, and if he were to destroy it, then that would end the zone and bring about a return to normality. It would save the world. So in Stalker 1, you go out and that's kind of the true ending. That's what canonically happens. Now, within the game itself, it's shown that the zone disappears after you destroy it. However, s.t.a.l.k.e.r says, I don't know if I was right or wrong, and I guess I'll never know. It's revealed, though, that he was wrong, because in Stalker Pripyat, after he destroyed sea consciousness, the zone grows completely out of control and has started to expand at a rapid rate, with emissions coming frequently and anomalies and artifacts becoming much more plentiful. It's really starting to look like that sea consciousness was telling the truth and was restraining its expansion, and now that the zone is just going to keep growing and growing until it occupies all of the Earth. Unfortunately, Pripyat ends without really resolving anything. The ultimate fate of mankind, the various factions other than Monolith, which fragmented and fell apart without sea consciousness, is completely unknown. We don't know if the Ukrainian government and the international scientists have really made any progress into fully understanding the zone, nor do we know if it is going to just continue to expand until it conquers the Earth. If Stalker 2 ever comes out, and they claim it will, maybe some of these questions will be answered, maybe some of them won't. As I said, a lot of this seems very haphazard and was kind of post hoc justified in the sequels. I don't know if they knew when they were making Stalker if they would be able to make any sequels, or if they just kind of came up with it as they went along. Regardless, I highly recommend the games, and that's kind of my attempt to explain the story and kind of the political underpinnings of it. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to you guys later.